If you stand unprotected on the open plains of North America in January, the wind will freeze the moisture inside your eyeballs in less than 3 minutes. The cold on the Great Plains does not merely freeze your skin, it hunts for your bones like an invisible beast, waiting for the exact moment you let your guard down to end you. This was the terrifying truth Alastair Vance kept repeating to himself as he adjusted his heavy woolen scarf and stared out across the vast, bleak expanse of the upper Missouri River Basin. It was late November, and the Crossley.com sky had taken on a heavy, leaden hue that Alastair had learned to fear during his brief time in the territory. As a land surveyor, he prided himself on his precise instruments, his formal education, and his reliance on modern industrial materials, believing that the structured progress of the 19th century could easily tame any wilderness. Yet, when he checked his brass barometer that afternoon, his heart sank at the sight of the mercury dropping with a sudden, violent speed that signaled the arrival of an Alberta clipper, a fast-moving, incredibly destructive Arctic storm that swept down from Canada with little warning. Alastair looked back at the log cabin outpost he had spent the last 2 months helping to build. The structure was constructed from heavy spruce logs, chinked with clay and anchored by a massive fieldstone chimney that stood like a monument to Western permanence. He believed that this building, with its thick, solid walls and robust square corners, was the absolute pinnacle of civilized shelter, capable of keeping the wilderness at bay no matter how low the temperature dropped. As the first scattered flakes of dry, powdery snow began to dance across the frozen grass, Alastair felt a wave of confidence return to his chest, trusting that his timber fortress would easily withstand the coming to winter. He packed up his brass transit, secured his heavy boots, and retreated inside the cabin, shutting the heavy oak door against the rising wind. He was convinced that the raw power of his fireplace, combined with the sheer mass of the spruce logs, would be more than enough to keep him warm and safe through the Placentine, longest, coldest night of his life. But Alastair's confidence was rooted in a profound misunderstanding of the profound misunderstanding. Northern Plains, where the open landscape offered absolutely nothing to slow down the incoming wind. He believed that because his walls were thick and his fire was roaring, the cold could not touch him, overlooking the reality that the wind does not merely freeze the air, but actively hunts for any thermal weakness in a structure. As the storm began to howl in earnest, shaking the heavy timber rafters overhead, Alastair stoked the firebox with dry split pine, watching the flames leap up the flue in a frantic attempt to establish a barrier of warmth. The dry snow hit the exterior log walls with a sound like throwing sand, and Alastair settled into his wooden chair near the hearth, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around his shoulders. He was determined to prove to himself that the building methods he had learned in the East were superior to any primitive shelter, completely unaware that the storm was about to expose every single flaw in his timber fort's design. If you want to learn how early builders, survivalists weathered these historical winters, subscribe our channel for more stories of quiet resilience and forgotten engineering wisdom. By midnight, the temperature outside had plummeted to a staggering minus 35 degrees, and the wind was screaming across the flat plains at over 40 miles an hour. Inside the log cabin outpost, Alastair Vance was living through a cold that felt entirely different from anything he had ever experienced, a silent, relentless chill that seemed to seep directly through the recantees and wood itself. He kept the fireplace burning at its absolute maximum capacity, throwing split log after split log into the hearth, but the heat seemed to vanish almost the instant it was produced. The problem was convective cooling, a physical process Alastair had never considered in his calculations, where the high-speed wind sweeping over the exterior log surface stripped away thermal energy faster than his fire could replace it. The massive spruce logs, rather than holding the warmth, acted like a massive radiator in reverse, drawing the frozen interior heat outward and releasing it into the frozen night, leaving the cabin's living space freezing. Alistair watched in disbelief as a thin layer of white frost began to form along the interior seams of the log walls, creeping steadily across the clay, chinking despite the roaring fire just feet away. He realized that a tight log cabin was a complete myth, as the extreme cold caused the timber to shrink and pull apart, creating microscopic gaps that allowed the Arctic wind to whistle through the dock room. The draft at ground level was so powerful that it actually caused the water in his bedside bucket to freeze solid, and Alistair had to keep his boots on just to prevent his toes from going numb while sitting near the hearth. He can't his oneaslacken.com. Tried stuffing woolen rags along the baseboards, but the moisture from his breath crystallized on the fabric almost instantly, turning his makeshift seals into frozen, useless blocks. The temperature in the corners of the cabin dropped to just above freezing, forcing Alistair to huddle closer and closer to the freezing fireplace, his face burning from the direct heat, while his back remained locked in an icy grip. He realized that his entire approach to winter heating was based on the reactive cycle of burning vast amounts of fuel just to heat air that escaped, almost immediately. His timber fortress, which had seemed so permanent and secure in October, was now revealed to be a drafty, inefficient box that required constant, exhausting labor to keep marginally livable. Alistair's hands shook with fatigue as he split more wood indoors, his breath rising in thick clouds that condensed and froze on the ceiling beams overhead. He was burning through what should have been a 3-week supply of seasoned cordwood in just a matter of days, realizing that if the storm persisted, he would run out of fuel long before the cold snap broke. The realization that his modern engineering had failed him was a bitter pill to swallow, leaving him alone in the dim, smoky cabin, listening to the logs groan under the immense pressure of the wind and wondering how anyone could survive this land. On the third morning of the blizzard, the wind showed no signs of slowing down, and Alistair Vance knew he was facing a desperate situation. One of his crucial brass surveying markers, located on a small ridge near the edge of the property, had to be checked before it was buried under the massive, shifting snowdrifts. Believing he could navigate the short distance, despite the whiteout conditions, Alistair wrapped himself in every layer of wool he owned, pulled on his heavy leather coat, and stepped out into the freezing storm. The moment he cleared the shelter of the cabin, the wind hit him with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet, driving the dry, icy snow directly into his face and blinding him instantly. Within 2 minutes of stepping outside, his fingers had stopped responding to his commands, the cold penetrating his thick mittens and freezing his joints until he could no longer hold his metal compass. Alistair tried to retrace his steps, but the ground blizzard had completely erased his tracks, leaving him in a spinning, featureless void, where sky and earth merged into a single, terrifying wall of white. His breath caught in his throat as the sub-zero air hit his lungs, causing him to cough violently, further depleting the little energy he had left. He stumbled through chest-deep drifts, his legs aching with fatigue, realizing that he was completely lost, that his body was rapidly succumbing to the lethal effects of hypothermia. Just as his knees buckled and he began to sink into the snow, resigned to the fact that he was going to freeze to death on the open plains, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. Through the swirling whiteout, the face of Tahimi, an elderly Lakota matriarch, appeared like a vision, her calm, dark eyes studying him with an atriarch expression of quiet determination. Tahimi did not speak a word, but her movements were organized and deliberate as she wrapped a thick buffalo robe around Alistair's shivering shoulders, helping him to his feet. She guided him down the slope of the ridge, away from the tan-exposed plains, and into a sheltered thunglung where her family had established their winter camp. Through the blowing snow, Alistair saw a small circle of Tipis standing quiet and stable against the storm, their conical shapes shedding the wind smoothly without any of the violent rattling that had plagued his log cabin. Tahimi led Alistair to the largest tipi in the center of the camp, lifted the heavy leather door flap, and guided him inside, where a wave of gentle, clean warmth hit his frozen face. As Alistair sank onto a bed of soft buffalo robes, his body began to thaw, his eyes widening as he looked around at the dry, comfortable interior of a structure he had always assumed was a primitive, leather tent. When Alistair Vance opened his eyes, the roar of the wind outside felt incredibly distant, replaced by the soft, crackling sound of a small fire burning in the center of the teepee. He lay on a raised platform of willow rods, wrapped in a massive buffalo fur that felt warmer and lighter than any of the heavy wool blankets he had left behind at his freezing outpost. Tahimi sat near the hearth, tending the fire with quiet, methodical movements that showed no sign of the frantic urgency Alistair had felt while trying to keep his cabin alive. He pushed back the fur and sat up, his body no longer shivering, his eyes immediately drawn to the elegant framework of timber poles that arched overhead to form the teepee's structure. He noticed that the skeleton of the lodge was remarkably simple, consisting of a series of slender cedar poles that converged at a single point near the apex, about 20 feet above the ground. Tahimi noticed his interest, and using slow, expressive gestures, began to explain the precise engineering that went into the construction of her family's home. She showed him how the entire structure was anchored by 3 primary cedar poles lashed together at the top with a thick cord made from dried buffalo sinew. She explained that when the sinew is first applied, it is wet, pliable, but as it dries it contracts with immense force, pulling the timber joints tighter than any iron bolt or man-made knot could ever manage. This tripod framework created a rigid, self-supporting base that could not be shaken or warped by the wind, distributing the structural load evenly across the ground. Alistair, with his formal surveyor's training, immediately recognized the geometric stability of the triangle, realizing that this design was inherently superior to the flat vertical walls of his log fort, which had to fight the wind's lateral pressure directly. Tahimi showed him how the remaining 14 poles were seated into the crotch of the tripod, creating a perfectly balanced frame that could flex with the wind instead of resisting it. The slender poles were chosen from slow-growing lodgepole pines, which were dense, flexible, and straight, allowing the structure to absorb the impact of 50-mile-an-hour gusts without cracking or shifting. Alistair realized that the entire assembly functioned as an integrated organic structure, a building that worked with the physics of the plains rather than trying to overpower them. As he listened to the wind slide over the curved exterior of the teepee, he felt a profound sense of humility, realizing that these people had designed a shelter that didn't need thick timber or iron fasteners to remain standing. If you enjoy learning about the hidden engineering behind traditional survival, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. The outer cover of the teepee was a single, massive sheet of leather that wrapped around the cedar poles with a precision that Alistair Vance found absolutely extraordinary. He watched as Tahimi's daughter, Winona, adjusted a section of the cover near the entrance, showing him how the various buffalo hides had been stitched together to form a seamless, weatherproof barrier. Tahimi explained that the cover was made from 18 select buffalo hides, taken from animals killed during the late fall when their skins were thickest and most durable. These hides were scraped clean of all flesh and hair, a labor-intensive process that required days of careful work using bone scrapers, before being subjected to a unique tanning process. The leather was brain-tanned, using the animal's own lipids, a method that broke down the stiff protein fibers and turned the hide into a material that remained soft and pliable, even in extreme sub-zero cold. Once tanned, The hides were smoked over a slow, wood tar fire, a chemical treatment that coated the leather fibers in natural aldehydes and phenols, waterproofing the material and preventing it from stiffening or rotting after a ciliar, heavy snow. Alistair touched the interior surface of the hide cover, finding it dry, supple, and surprisingly warm, with none of the damp, icy feel of his cabin's spruce logs. He realized that the smoked leather acted as a highly effective vapor barrier, shedding water and snow on the outside while preventing interior condensation from soaking into the structure. The cover was held together along the front seam with wooden pins, allowing the family to adjust the tension of the hide depending on the humidity and wind speed. This responsive design ensured that the cover remained taut and quiet, never flapping or tearing even during the most violent winter gales. Alistair's mind raced as he compared this elegant, single-layer skin with the heavy, multi-layered walls of his log cabin, which had required hundreds of pounds of timber, clay, and iron to achieve far inferior results. He saw that the buffalo hide cover was not just a tent wall, but a sophisticated, semi-permeable membrane that worked in harmony with the environment, keeping weather out while letting the building breathe. The shape of the teepee allowed snow to slide off the slick, smoked surface immediately, preventing any dangerous weight accumulation that could threaten to collapse the structure. He realized that the materials chosen by these people were not a compromise born of scarcity, but a highly evolved selection based on generations of empirical testing designed to perform perfectly under the most extreme conditions on the continent. As Alistair Vance studied the interior of the teepee more closely, he noticed a structural feature that shattered his assumptions about traditional conical shelters. He realized that the teepee was not a perfect, symmetrical cone as he had always assumed from a distance, but was instead tilted in a highly deliberate, asymmetrical shape. Tahimi pointed to the steep back wall of the lodge, which faced directly northwest, to meet the prevailing Arctic winds that swept down from Canada. This steep slope allowed the high-velocity wind to slide over the back of the teepee with minimal resistance, creating a highly aerodynamic profile that prevented the wind from lifting or shifting the structure. The front wall, facing southeast, was much more gradual, shifting the apex of the plain, lodge, and the smoke hole slightly forward of the center. Tahimi explained that this asymmetrical design was essential for both wind, resistance, and interior comfort, creating a layout that maximized space where the family needed it most. The steeper back wall provided more headroom and allowed the family to place their willow beds and buffalo robes close to the perimeter. Without touching the cold leather skin, this kept the center of the lodge open for the hearth, while the gentler front slope directed the rising heat and smoke toward the off-center smoke hole with remarkable efficiency. Alistair, using his surveyor's eye, could see that this tilted geometry shifted the teepee's center of gravity closer to the ground, anchoring it firmly against the wind without requiring any heavy foundations or guy lines. The entire structure sat like a low-profile pyramid, its broad base and sloped sides deflecting the wind's energy instead of trying to block it with flat vertical surfaces. He realized that the flat-walled design of his log cabin was a major architectural error in this wind-swept environment, as it presented a massive obstacle to the wind, creating high-pressure zones that forced cold air through every gap. The teepee's curved, asymmetrical shape, on the other hand, worked with the wind, using its velocity to actually press the structure more firmly against the earth, creating a secure shelter. This geometric elegance was a revelation to Alistair, who had spent his career believing that right angles and straight lines were the only proper way to construct a durable building. He saw that these women had designed a home that was completely integrated with the physics of their environment, using shape and angle to accomplish what his log fort could not achieve with all its weight and mass. while the outer buffalo hide cover of the teepee blocked the wind and shed the wide snow. Alistair Vance soon discovered that the true heart of the heating system lay in a second, interior wall. Tahimi showed him the inner lining, a beautiful curtain of soft, tanned hides that hung from a rope circling the interior poles, at a height of about 6 feet. This lining extended all the way to the ground, where its lower edge was tucked inward and weighted firmly with heavy river, stones, and dry grass. This created a dead-air insulation gap, a 3-foot wide pocket of trapped, unmoving air between the inner lining and the outer cover that functioned as a highly effective barrier against the cold. Alistair, touching the lining, was amazed to find it was warm to the touch, holding a temperature that felt entirely different from the freezing log walls of his outpost. Tahimi explained that this lining did far more than simply insulate the lodge. It created a coordinated convective air loop that warmed the entire interior without creating drafts. Cold, fresh air from outside entered at ground level under the slightly raised outer cover, but instead of blowing directly across the floor, it was forced to rise behind the inner lining. As this cold air traveled upward through the gap, it absorbed radiant heat from the lining, warming up before it spilled over the top of the curtain and descended gently to feed the central fire. This meant that the fresh air suium the fire was already preheated, while the living and sleeping areas where the family sat remained completely draft-free and comfortable. Alistair compared this with his cabin, where the fireplace drew cold drafts directly across the floor from the door seams, freezing his feet while his face burned. He saw that the inner lining had turned the entire tipi into a highly efficient chimney, using natural pressure differentials to manage the movement of air, heat. The smoke from the fire rose straight up to the apex, drawn by the rising current of warm air behind the lining, leaving the air at eye level incredibly clean and breathable. This convective loop was an elegant piece of engineering, a design that solved the problems of ventilation and draft control in a single integrated system that required no mechanical parts. Alistair felt a wave of professional admiration for these women, who had designed a Plasix thermodynamic shield that was vastly superior to any heating system he had ever seen in the East. To support our work in uncovering these forgotten historical technologies, consider subscribing our channel and sharing this video with others. As Alistair Vance spent more time inside the teepee, he noticed another remarkable phenomenon. The interior air remained completely dry and comfortable, with absolutely no condensation forming on the walls. In his log cabin, the moisture from his breath and cooking had condensed on the cold spruce logs, freezing into thick layers of frost that melted and dripped down the walls whenever the fire got hot. But inside the tipi, the Vachlo remained dry and soft, holding no moisture even when the temperature outside dropped to 35 below zero. He asked Tahimi about this, and she explained that the secret lay in the brain tanning and smoking process they used to treat the buffalo hides. She showed him how the brain tanning introduced lecithin into the leather fibers, a natural fat that prevented the hides from stiffening or cracking in the sub-zero cold, keeping them pliable and resilient. The subsequent smoke, curing, coated the fibers in wood tar compounds, creating a material that was highly hydrophobic, meaning it shed water on the outside while remaining vapor permeable from the inside. This allowed the teepee to act as a semi-permeable membrane, letting moisture from breath and cooking filter out through the leather while keeping the interior space dry and insulated. Alistair, with his understanding of materials, realized that this was a highly advanced solution to the condensation problem that plagued most metal and logazero structures of his era. He saw that his own building traditions were focused on creating airtight barriers that trapped moisture inside, leading to rot, mold, and freezing, dampness that compromised the structure's durability. The tipi, on the other hand, used a breathable skin that managed moisture dynamically, working with the natural laws of vapor pressure to keep the interior environment healthy. This chemical and physical sophistication was a testament to the deep, empirical knowledge these women possessed, a wisdom passed down through generations of grandmothers teaching granddaughters. Alastair realized that his assumptions about Western superiority were completely unfounded, as these people had mastered materials and chemistry to create a healthier, more durable home than anything his colleagues could build with all their modern tools. The crowning detail of the Tipis ventilation system was the two adjustable smoke flaps or ears that sat at the apex of the lodge, framing the exit hole for the smoke. Alastair Vance watched as Tahimi adjusted the long poles that controlled these flaps, shifting them in response to a change in the wind direction outside. She explained that these flaps functioned like a modern damper, allowing the family to regulate the draft of the fire and protect the Pernice interior from rain, snow, and wind. By closing the windward flap and leaving the leeward flap open, they created a barrier that prevented the wind from blowing smoke back down into the lodge. Alastair, studying the air currents, realized that this arrangement created a powerful Venturi effect, a physical principle he had learned in engineering school, but had never seen applied so elegantly. As the high-speed wind swept over the tilted cone of the teepee, it was forced to accelerate over the open leeward flap, creating a low-pressure zone directly above the smoke hole. This low pressure acted like an invisible vacuum, actively drawing smoke and stale air up from the hearth and out of the lodge, even when the fire was burning low. This meant that the teepee's interior stayed completely clear of smoke, even during the most violent blizzards, when standard chimneys were backdrafting and filling cabins with choking fumes. He saw that the smoke flaps were not just simple leather flaps, but a responsive, aerodynamic control system that allowed the family to manage the interior climate with remarkable precision. The ability to adjust the flaps in real time meant that the tipi could adapt to any weather condition, from a dead calm to a screaming gale, without losing its thermal efficiency. Alastair compared this with the rigid, static chimneys of his own tradition, which often failed during high winds, forcing families to choose between freezing without fire or suffocating with it. He realized that these women had designed a ventilation system that was more advanced, more reliable, and more responsive than anything his colleagues had ever drafted on paper. By the fourth day of the blizzard, the storm had reached its absolute peak, turning the world outside the teepee into a screaming, chaotic void of white. The wind was gusting at over 50 miles an hour, driving the temperature down to a bone-chilling 40 below zero, a cold so extreme that it felt like a physical weight pressing against the lodge. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained remarkably steady, the curved cedar poles of the teepee flexing slightly under the quote-endo immense wind pressure without any of the creaking or groaning Alastair Vance had heard in his cabin. He watched as Tahimi and her family went about their daily alusker routine with a quiet, unhurried confidence that showed they trusted their home completely to protect them. To prepare for the coldest hours of the storm, Tahimi's sons stepped out into Boutwan, the blizzard, to pack a thick bank of snow around the base of the outer hide cover. Alastair noticed that they did not pile the snow directly against the leather, as direct contact with the wet snow would cause the hides to stiffen and rot over time. Instead, they placed a thick layer of dry grass and brush against the leather first, creating a protective barrier before banking the snow, nearly 3 feet high against the structure. This snowbank functioned as an insulating skirt, blocking ground-level winds from entering under the outer cover and further reducing heat loss from the lower half of the lodge. Alastair could see that this snow skirt, combined with the grass insulation, had effectively turned the lower part of the tipi into an earth-sheltered structure, holding the warmth inside. Inside, the family had stuffed more dried grass into the 3-foot gap between the inner lining and the outer cover, creating another layer of trapped air that further enhanced the insulation value of the walls. Alistair checked his pocket thermometer, finding that the interior temperature held steady at an incredible 64 degrees Fahrenheit, even as the wind chill outside dropped to 80-20-10 below. He realized that the teepee's low-profile, aerodynamic shape was its greatest asset, as it allowed the violent wind to slide over the curved leather surface without creating any of the high-pressure zones that forced drafts through cabin walls. The entire structure sat quiet and secure in the middle of Dakam. The blizzard, a warm, safe cocoon that felt completely decoupled from the frozen fury of the plains. Just as Alistair Vance was marveling at the thermal stability of the teepee, the Devon and the teepee the Devon, leather door flap was suddenly thrown open, letting in a swirl of freezing snow and a blast of Arctic air. Tahimi's eldest son, Chapa, stumbled inside carrying the semi-conscious body of Connor, Alistair's colleague who had been left behind at the log cabin outpost. Chapa had traveled to the outpost on snowshoes to check on the structure, finding that the log fort's chimney had cracked under the thermal stress of the extreme cold. The cracked flue had filled the cabin with thick, choking smoke, forcing Connor to put out the fire and huddle in his bedding, where he was rapidly freezing to death in the sub-zero room. Both Alistair and Chapa worked quickly to strip off Connor's frozen coat, wrapping him in warm buffalo robes and moving him close to the central hearth, where the dry heat could begin to restore his circulation. Connor's hands were white and stiff with frostbite, his breathing shallow and rattling, his body shaking violently as the warmth of the teepee began to thaw his frozen limbs. Alistair watched in silence as Tahimi prepared a warm, soothing broth of dried meat and berries, feeding it to Connor with a gentle, patient care that showed she had seen this kind of suffering many times before. Within an hour, Connor's shivering began to slow, the color returning to his face as the steady, radiant heat of the lodge penetrated deep into his chilled bones. Connor looked around the teepee, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and relief, as he realized that he had been saved from certain death by the very structure they had mocked just weeks before. He looked at Alistair, his voice a one-yen weak whisper, and muttered, "It's warm in here, Alistair. Actually warm." Alistair nodded in silence, a lump forming in his throat as he realized the scale of their architectural arrogance. Their expensive, modern log fort, which they had believed was a monument to progress, was now a freezing, smoke-filled tomb. While this primitive leather tent had saved both of their lives, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and humility, realizing that the survival wisdom of these people was the only true science that mattered in this unforgiving land. As the night wore on and the storm continued to howl outside, Tahimi began the briefless preparations for the family's sleep, a process that Alistair Vance watched with fascination. Instead of relying on a continuous roaring fire to keep the teepee warm overnight, which would require constant labor and burn through their commonplace firewood, Tahimi focused on storing heat. She used long wooden tongs to pull several large river stones from the fire pit, stones that had been absorbing heat from the coals for hours until they glowed with a deep, silent warmth. She wrapped these hot stones in thick pieces of old worn hide to prevent them from burning the bedding, then placed them directly beneath the willow sleeping platforms where the family slept. Alistair, climbing onto his own platform, was amazed to find that these hot stones functioned as highly effective, slow-release radiators, warming the space beneath his bedding with a gentle, consistent heat. The warmth rose through the Tahitian willow rods and the thick buffalo robes, creating a personal microclimate that kept his body comfortable throughout the coldest hours of the night. He realized that this thermal mass strategy allowed the family to let the main fire burn down to a bed of glowing coals, saving coals and preventing the teepee from overheating while they slept. The stone batteries would continue to radiate heat for 6 to 8 hours, holding the interior temperature well above freezing, even as the outside temperature dropped to 40 below zero. He lay in the dark, feeling the steady warmth beneath him, his mind reflecting on the immense efficiency of this design compared to the frantic, sleepless nights he had spent at the outpost. In his cabin, he had been forced to wake every 3 hours to stoke the fire, burning through cords of wood just to heat air that escaped almost immediately through the drafty walls. Here, these people slept peacefully through the night, using nothing more than a few hot stones, the natural insulation of the earth, to maintain a comfortable, safe environment. He felt a deep sense of peace and security, realizing that he had never slept so well in his life, and that the answers to survival were not found in complex machinery, but in the quiet, elegant laws of nature. When Alistair Vance awoke the next morning, the silence inside the teepee was absolute, a peaceful stillness that signaled the storm had finally passed. He pushed back the buffalo robes and stood up, finding the interior air fresh, dry, and comfortably warm, even though the central fire had burned down to a small pile of gray ash. He climbed up the ladder and pushed open the leather door, flap, stepping out into a world that had been transformed into a stunning, blinding desert of white. The sun was rising into a sky so clear and blue it hurt his eyes, reflecting off snowdrifts that piled 10 feet high against the blank trees in the Thunglung below. Alistair walked to the edge of the camp, looking back at the teepee where he had spent the last 6 days, and felt a profound sense of humility washing over him. He realized that his entire understanding of architecture, progress, and engineering had been completely overturned by his experience inside that leather lodge. He had come to the plains believing that his modern education and industrial materials made him superior to the native people, viewing their teepees as primitive shelters that offered little protection from the brutal winter. Yet, when he did the math, he realized that Tahimi's family had used less than a quarter of the wood his outpost had burned, while maintaining an environment that was 20 degrees warmer and completely draft-free. He saw that the teepee was not a primitive tent, but a highly structured, aerodynamic shelter that worked in perfect harmony with the natural laws of thermodynamics. Every element of the design, from the asymmetrical cone that deflected the wind to the inner lining that created the convective loop, was a purposeful solution to a specific environmental challenge. He felt a deep sense of shame for his earlier arrogance, realizing that he and his colleagues had tried to force their Eastern building traditions onto a land they did not understand, nearly paying for their pride with their lives. He resolved to document everything he had learned, determined to share the quiet, elegant science of the teepee with his fellow builders back in the cities. Before Alistair Vance and Connor packed their gear to return to the town, Alistair walked to Tahimi's teepee to express his deepest gratitude to the woman who had saved their lives. He found Tahimi sitting near the hearth, her weathered hands working a piece of soft deer hide with a practiced efficiency that showed a lifetime of labor. He knelt beside her, his voice quiet and sincere, as he thanked her for her hospitality, her care, and the profound lessons she had taught him about her people's home. Tahimi looked at him, her dark eyes warming with a gentle smile, and reached into a small leather bag beside her. She pulled out a pair of beautiful moccasins, made from thick, brain-tanned buffalo hide and lined with soft, insulating fur, and pressed them into Alistair's hands. She showed him how the seams had been stitched with sinew, explaining through gestures that these shoes would keep his feet warm and dry, even during the coldest treks across the plains. Alistair held the moccasins, feeling the soft, supple leather, and realized that this gift was a physical representation of the survival wisdom he had experienced inside her lodge. He slipped his feet into the shoes, finding them warmer and more comfortable than his heavy leather boots, realizing that the same principles that made the teepee work trapped dead air and moisture control were scaled down perfectly to protect the human body. As Alistair and Connor walked out of the Thung Lung, their snowshoes crunching in the crisp, dry snow, Alistair looked back one final time at the circle of teepees, standing quiet and proud against the blue winter sky. He saw the thin, steady trails of smoke rising from the apexes, carrying the warmth of the families inside up into the cold air. He realized that this knowledge was not recorded in engineering textbooks or stored in government archives, but was preserved in the placed hands of grandmothers teaching granddaughters across hundreds of generations. It was a living, breathing science, a legacy of quiet resilience and deep environmental understanding that had allowed these people to thrive on this harsh land. And Alistair knew he would carry that warmth with him for the rest of his life. When Alistair Vance finally returned to his drafting table in the spring, his survey maps remained blank for weeks. He found himself unable to draw the rigid, straight lines of property boundaries without remembering the graceful, wind-swept curves of the Tipis that had sheltered him. The experience had permanently altered his understanding of what it meant to build a home, prompting him to scrap his plans for traditional timber cabins and instead begin designing structures that incorporated the passive, aerodynamic principles of To the Plains. The survival of the Lakota through the most brutal winters on the continent was never an accident of luck, but the result of a highly evolved engineering tradition passed down through generations of women. By understanding the physics of convective loops, the chemistry of smoked hides, and the thermal mass of river stones, they had created a shelter that bypassed the limitations of their materials. It was a science of humility, a design philosophy that sought to understand and work with the laws of nature rather than trying to conquer them with weight and fuel. The teepee remains a powerful monument to this quiet wisdom, a reminder that the most elegant solutions are often those that require the least resources and the deepest observation. In a world increasingly dominated by complex, energy-dependent machinery, the lessons of the Plains grandmothers offer a timeless alternative, a reminder that real progress lies not in the thickness of our walls, but in the clarity of our understanding of the earth beneath our feet.